It was a quiet, golden morning in a small suburban town where the streets still carried the soft smell of dew and fresh bread from the corner bakery. Mr. Harold, a gentle old man in his 70s, walked slowly toward the park, holding a brown paper bag filled with crumbs for the birds. His back was slightly bent, his steps careful but steady, and his eyes calm behind thin-framed glasses. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him. The children waved every morning, calling him Grandpa Harold, and he always smiled, offering a kind word or a small story from his younger days. The park was his favorite place, a peaceful corner where he could read, feed the pigeons, and listen to the laughter of life moving around him. That morning seemed no different from any other. He sat on his favorite wooden bench under a tall oak tree, opened his old worn-out book, and began to read. The birds gathered at his feet, pecking happily at the crumbs he scattered. Everything felt calm, until the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence. A police car rolled to a stop nearby, its engine humming softly but its presence loud enough to change the air. Two young officers stepped out, their boots heavy against the path. They looked around, as if searching for trouble, their eyes finally landing on Harold. The older man looked up from his book, a gentle smile still on his face, thinking perhaps they were lost or needed directions. But the officers didn't smile back. One of them, tall and stern, asked sharply, "Sir, what are you doing here?" Harold blinked, confused by the tone, and replied politely, "Just reading, officer. Feeding the birds, like I do every morning." The younger officer glanced at the other and frowned. "Do you have an ID?" he asked, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Harold's smile faded slightly. "I left my wallet at home," he said softly, "but I live right around the corner. Everyone here knows me." His words were calm, but the officer's suspicion grew. They exchanged glances, as if his kindness itself made them doubt him. One of them spoke into his radio, mumbling something Harold couldn't quite hear. The tension in the air grew thicker, and people began to slow down as they passed by, whispering, watching from a distance. Harold could feel their eyes, not of comfort, but of curiosity. The peace that had filled his morning slowly turned into unease. He placed his book on his lap, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "Officers," he said quietly, "I'm not doing anything wrong." The taller one sighed impatiently. "We got a report about someone loitering in this area. We have to check." Harold nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He wanted to explain that he had been sitting on that bench for years, that even the birds expected him every morning, but he could see from their faces that they weren't listening. The gentle morning sun now felt harsh against his skin. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves no longer soothed him. For the first time in years, the park felt like a stranger's place. The officers stood over him, their questions sharp, their eyes restless, while Harold sat quietly, refusing to let fear replace his dignity. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and whispered a silent prayer, not out of anger, but for patience. He prayed that the goodness he had always believed in still existed, somewhere behind those badges. He remembered his son's words, long ago, "Stay calm, Dad, even when people don't see your heart." So he did. He kept his voice low, his posture humble, and his spirit strong. Around him, the world kept moving, a child's laughter in the distance, the chirping of birds still pecking at the crumbs, and the distant hum of the patrol car's engine. But inside Harold, something quiet changed. He realized that sometimes, even in the most peaceful places, a person's heart must hold steady against the weight of misunderstanding. The officers continued to question him, unaware that their simple doubt was chiseling away at a man's lifelong faith and kindness. Yet Harold didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't let bitterness rise. He sat there still, dignified, and silently brave as the sun climbed higher, turning that peaceful morning into one he would never forget. The morning sun had risen higher now, painting long shadows across the park where Mr. Harold still sat on the wooden bench, facing two officers who didn't seem ready to believe a word he said. What had begun as a quiet morning had turned into something tense and uncomfortable. The taller officer crossed his arms, scanning Harold's old jacket and worn shoes, as though searching for a reason to doubt him. The younger one paced slowly, his tone growing sharper with each question. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again," he said firmly. "Why are you here?" Harold's calm eyes lifted toward them, his voice soft but steady. "Son," he said, the same way he might have spoken to one of his own, "I'm just feeding the birds." His words carried no anger, no challenge, only truth. But somehow that quiet kindness irritated the younger officer even more. He mistook Harold's patience for stubbornness. "Don't call me son," he snapped, his voice cutting through the still air. Harold's hands rested on his knees, his fingers trembling just a little, not from fear, but from age. "I mean no disrespect," he murmured, looking down at the crumbs scattered near his feet. The pigeons still pecking, as if nothing around them had changed. A few people walking by began to slow down. They sensed tension in the air, that uneasy kind of silence that draws attention without words. One woman took out her phone, pretending to check messages, but quietly pressing record. A man from across the street folded his arms and whispered to someone beside him. The small park, once filled with laughter and peace, now felt like a stage, and Harold was unwillingly at its center. "Can we see some ID?" the tall officer asked again, his tone clipped, professional but cold. Harold's heart sank a little. He had left his wallet on the kitchen table, right beside the bowl of birdseed. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "It's at home. My house is just down the street." The younger officer exhaled heavily, shaking his head. "That's what they all say," he muttered under his breath, pressing a button on his radio. The sound of static filled the air, followed by a short message calling for backup. Harold looked around at the children now stopped on the sidewalk, at the mothers pulling them gently away, at the shopkeeper across the road watching through his window, and he felt something shift inside him. The warmth that the town once gave him, the smiles and greetings he always received, suddenly felt far away. It was as if everyone had quietly stepped back, leaving him to face the moment alone. Yet, even as the weight of misunderstanding pressed down on him, he chose calm. He had faced harder days in life. He had seen unfairness before, but he had promised himself never to let bitterness win. "It's going to be all right," he whispered, not only to himself, but as if reminding the world. The taller officer frowned. "What did you say?" Harold met his eyes gently. "It's going to be all right," he repeated. The officer hesitated, confused by the old man's calmness. For a moment, the air softened, but then the younger officer stepped forward again, his voice firm. "Sir, stay where you are. We'll sort this out when backup arrives." Harold nodded, folding his hands together. Inside, his heart beat heavily, not from fear of what might happen, but from sadness that his quiet morning, filled with small joys, had turned into a public misunderstanding. He looked down at his open book on the bench beside him. It was a story about courage, about standing tall in silence. How strange, he thought, that a story could mirror life in such unexpected ways. Around him, whispers grew louder. Some people spoke up. "He's harmless. That's Mr. Harold." But their voices were drowned out by others filming, others murmuring without stepping closer. The air carried a strange mix of curiosity and hesitation. The sound of another car engine echoed in the distance. Backup was coming. Harold straightened his posture slightly, smoothing the wrinkles of his coat, his pride quiet but intact. He had always believed that one's dignity wasn't in how loud they spoke, but in how calmly they carried themselves through storms. As the minutes stretched, the tension lingered, invisible but heavy. The park bench, the birds, the sunlight, all the simple beauty of the morning felt trapped beneath a cloud of suspicion. Still, Harold didn't let anger take root. He glanced at the officers, then at the crowd, and offered a faint, reassuring smile, as if saying, "Don't worry, this will pass." The sincerity in his eyes made some bystanders lower their phones, uncertain now about what they were witnessing. To them, the situation looked complicated, but to Harold, it was heartbreakingly simple, a misunderstanding born from fear, not truth. The younger officer turned his back to speak into the radio again, while the older one watched Harold closely, his expression now uncertain. Something in the old man's quiet eyes began to unsettle him. There was no defiance there, only grace. The kind of grace that comes from a lifetime of choosing peace, even when the world doesn't offer it back. And as the sirens grew faintly in the distance, signaling that more police were on their way, Harold whispered once more, almost to himself, "It's going to be all right." His words drifted into the warm air, fragile but powerful, a reminder that even in misunderstanding, a calm heart can hold more strength than a loud world ever will. The tension in the park had thickened like a fog by the time the second police car rolled in. Its siren blared once, before fading into a low hum, and the quiet street seemed to stop breathing. Mr. Harold sat still on the bench, his frail hands folded tightly, his calm eyes fixed on the ground. The officers stood near him, their posture firm but uneasy, while the growing crowd watched in silence. The sound of heavy boots on gravel filled the air as two more officers stepped out of the backup car, ready to assess the situation. But before they could say a word, the deep growl of another engine echoed from the corner of the street. A black SUV, sleek and polished, slowed to a stop beside the park. Its doors opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in a crisp, navy uniform. His presence immediately drew attention. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight, and his steady movements carried the quiet authority of someone used to command. It was Commander David Harold's only son. He had returned home from overseas just that morning, planning to surprise his father with breakfast after months apart. But the sight before him froze him in place. His father, the kindest man he knew, was sitting on a bench surrounded by officers, with strangers filming from every angle. For a moment, disbelief washed over him. He blinked, as if trying to make sense of a nightmare that didn't belong in daylight. Then, without hesitation, he walked forward, his boots hitting the pavement with measured strength. The crowd parted instinctively, their murmurs fading into whispers. The officers turned toward him, one of them raising a hand to stop him. But something about the way David carried himself made them hesitate. His eyes were sharp, yet calm, the kind of calm that spoke of control, of experience, of someone who had faced chaos and refused to let it define him. He stopped a few steps away and said, his voice low but firm, "What's going on here?" The taller officer began to explain, his words quick and defensive. "Sir?" This man, but before he could finish, David raised a hand, not in anger, but with a quiet authority that silenced the entire space. "That man," he said, pointing gently toward Harold, "is my father." The words landed like thunder. Every whisper died instantly. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight. The younger officer's mouth fell open slightly, his eyes flicking between Harold and the commander's uniform. David's gaze softened as he looked at his father. "Dad," he said, stepping closer, "are you all right?" Harold nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his face. "I'm fine, son," he whispered, his voice trembling but peaceful. The taller officer swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. The younger one took a small step back, regret already spreading across his face. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice broke the silence. "That's Commander David, the Navy SEAL." Phones lifted higher as recognition spread. Just a week ago, the local news had run a story about him, the hero who had led a daring rescue mission overseas, saving an entire crew trapped in a flooded ship. His face had been everywhere, the local papers, the evening news, even the town's community board. The same people who had been filming moments ago now felt the sting of shame. The whispers turned into uneasy silence. Some lowered their phones, others looked away completely. The officers' faces turned pale as the realization of who they had confronted settled in. Commander David, the man they had just seen on television, being honored for bravery, was standing before them, and they had just humiliated his father. David took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, his calm presence spoke louder than any words could. "This is the man who taught me everything I know about respect," he said quietly, his eyes moving between the officers. "He taught me to treat people with kindness, no matter who they are. I guess not everyone learns that the same way." His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried the weight of truth, a truth that left the officers speechless. The taller one opened his mouth as if to apologize, but found no words. Harold, watching his son, felt a mix of pride and sorrow. He wished none of this had happened, but seeing David stand with such quiet dignity filled his heart with warmth. Round them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, their guilt too heavy to bear. The cameras that once recorded the scene of doubt now captured the image of a father and son standing together, one humble, one heroic, both strong in spirit. The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves above, and for the first time in that tense morning, the air felt lighter. The officers finally stepped back, their eyes lowered, their authority silenced not by rank, but by the quiet power of truth. David placed a hand on his father's shoulder and said softly, "Let's go home, Dad." As they turned to leave, the onlookers could only watch in silence, realizing they had just witnessed not just a misunderstanding, but a moment that revealed what real honor looked like, not in medals or uniforms, but in grace, dignity, and the courage to stay calm when the world falters. The morning air hung still after Commander David's words had silenced the entire park. The crowd that had once whispered and filmed now stood frozen, unsure what to do or say. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between each other, the weight of guilt settling like a heavy shadow. David slowly stepped forward, his polished boots brushing the gravel as he reached his father. Mr. Harold sat quietly on the bench, his wrinkled hands resting on his lap, his book still open beside him. The page creased where he had stopped reading. David bent slightly, extending his strong hand toward him. "Come on, Dad," he said softly, his tone filled with warmth. Harold hesitated for a moment, not out of weakness, but because he wanted this moment to settle, to teach something deeper than anger ever could. He looked up at his son, his tired eyes glistening under the sunlight, and finally reached out. David gently lifted him to his feet, steadying him with care. Their eyes met, father and son, two men bound not just by blood, but by shared dignity and strength. The crowd watched in silence as Harold straightened his back, trying to hide the slight tremble in his knees. Despite the morning's events, his presence carried quiet grace, a reminder that true strength doesn't shout. It stands tall, even when shaken. David turned slowly to face the officers. His face was calm, but there was something powerful in his gaze, a mix of disappointment and composure. "Do you know what this man taught me?" he began, his voice low but steady enough for everyone around to hear. The words floated through the air like ripples across still water. "He taught me to respect every person," David continued, "even when they don't respect you." The silence that followed was so deep that even the wind seemed to pause. The officers lowered their heads slightly, their earlier pride melting into quiet shame. No one dared interrupt. The younger officer, who had spoken the harshest before, clenched his jaw, regret flashing in his eyes. The taller one nodded faintly, unable to meet Harold's gaze. David's tone softened, but his words only grew heavier. "My father," he said, glancing toward Harold with pride, "has more courage than any uniform I wear. He doesn't need a title, or medals, or applause. He lives with honor, something no rank can give or take away. The truth in his voice cut deeper than anger ever could. It wasn't an accusation. It was a lesson, one that everyone present could feel in their bones. For a long moment, nobody moved. The birds returned to the path, pecking near Harold's shoes, as if the park itself wanted to return to peace. David stepped closer to the officers, his eyes no longer sharp but filled with quiet empathy. "Before you judge the next person sitting on a park bench," he said softly, "remember this moment. Remember that you don't see a person's story just by looking at their face." The younger officer's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The weight of his silence said enough. The taller officer swallowed, nodding faintly, his voice barely above a whisper, as he murmured, We understand, sir." David didn't respond. He simply turned back to his father, who had been watching the scene unfold with patient eyes. Harold reached out and placed a gentle hand on his son's arm. His voice, frail but steady, carried warmth that eased the tension like sunlight after a storm. "Let's go home, son," he said. There was no anger in his tone, no bitterness, only deep weariness mixed with grace. His words weren't just meant for David. They were for everyone standing there. It was forgiveness without fanfare, humility without weakness. David nodded, resting his hand over his father's in quiet agreement. Together, they began walking toward the path leading out of the park. The crowd slowly stepped aside to make way, their expressions softening into a mix of guilt and admiration. Some lowered their phones, others looked down, ashamed of having watched instead of acted. As the father and son moved past the officers, the younger one whispered, "Sir, we're sorry." Harold turned slightly, offering a faint smile, one that spoke of understanding, not approval. "Just do better next time," he replied gently. His voice carried a kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime of choosing grace over resentment. The officers nodded silently, their pride now replaced by respect. The park grew quiet again, but the silence this time was different, not tense, not fearful, but thoughtful. People slowly dispersed, each carrying a piece of what they had witnessed. The news would later call it a misunderstanding, but those who were there knew it was more than that. It was a moment when humility met authority, when truth rose above judgment. As David and Harold reached the street corner, the old man looked up at his son and smiled faintly. "You did well," he said. David smiled back, eyes glimmering with emotion. "I just followed your example, Dad." Harold chuckled softly, the sound gentle and pure, and together they walked toward home, two men of different generations, united by the quiet truth that respect and kindness, even in the face of misunderstanding, are the greatest strengths a person can ever show. The next morning, the sky glowed softly with the colors of dawn, painting the park in shades of gold and pink. The same bench sat under the same tall oak tree, and there, as always, was Mr. Harold. His movements were slow but peaceful as he scattered breadcrumbs for the pigeons fluttering around his feet. The air was quiet, except for the gentle cooing of the birds and the faint rustle of leaves. It was as if the park itself wanted to make peace after the storm that had shaken it the day before. But Harold seemed untouched by bitterness. His old book rested beside him, open to a page he hadn't finished, and his eyes carried the same calm patience that had never left him. He didn't look angry or proud. He simply looked at home, the same man who had chosen kindness over resentment. Then, from across the path, two familiar figures appeared. The same two officers from yesterday approached slowly, their uniforms neat but their steps unsure. They weren't the confident men they had been the day before. Their eyes were heavy with guilt, their pride left somewhere behind. As they neared, one of them spoke softly, almost whispering, "Sir, we're sorry." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, trembling with sincerity. Harold looked up, his kind eyes meeting theirs. A small smile curved his lips, not of triumph, but of understanding. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of forgiveness. "You owe it to yourselves." The officers blinked, taken aback by his response. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Harold extended his hand, holding a small piece of bread. "Here," he said, motioning toward the pigeons. "Help me feed them." The two men hesitated at first, unsure if they deserved even this simple kindness. But eventually, they took the bread and tossed it toward the birds. The pigeons hopped closer, pecking eagerly, and the tension in the air began to ease. A strange peace settled over the small group. The officers exchanged small glances, awkward smiles at first, then quiet laughter when one of the birds landed too close to their shoes. For the first time, they saw Harold not as a stranger, not as someone to question, but as a man, gentle, wise, and unshakably kind. "You come here every morning?" one of them asked. Harold nodded. "Every day. It's my little reminder that life still has good in it, even when people forget to see it." His words were simple, yet they sank deep into their hearts. The younger officer, who had been the most defensive the day before, looked at the old man and said quietly, "You didn't have to forgive us." Harold chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Forgiveness isn't for others," he said. "It's for your own peace. Carry anger too long, and it only weighs you down." The officers stood silently, letting the wisdom settle like sunlight breaking through clouds. Days passed, and word of what had happened in the park began to spread through the town. People whispered not about the mistake, but about the forgiveness that followed. The story reached the mayor, and soon, plans were made to honor Harold and his son, Commander David, for their example of compassion and unity. A few weeks later, the community gathered in that same park. Children, families, officers, and neighbors who had once only watched from a distance. Small flags waved in the warm breeze, and a modest stage was set near Harold's favorite bench. When David stood to speak, he didn't talk about his military missions or his medals. He spoke about his father, the man who had taught him that true courage isn't just found on battlefields, but in hearts that refuse to hate. His voice trembled slightly when he said, "My father has always believed that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength in its purest form." The crowd applauded softly, many wiping tears from their eyes. When it was Harold's turn to speak, he simply smiled and said, "Forgiveness is what keeps a heart light enough to see the good in people again." As the event ended and the sun began to sink behind the trees, Harold returned to his bench one last time that evening. The park was quiet now, empty except for the distant laughter of children heading home. He watched the sky fade into orange and purple, the light wrapping the world in peace. He took a slow breath, feeling the soft air brush against his face, and whispered to himself, "Sometimes the strongest lesson comes from staying kind when the world isn't." His words drifted gently into the twilight, carried away by the evening breeze, and in that moment, it felt as though the whole town, the park, the people, even the birds had learned something that would never be forgotten, that dignity, forgiveness, and compassion have the power to turn even the coldest misunderstanding into a moment of quiet grace.